Well, good morning. My name is Carey Roberts. I'm a historian at Liberty University. I've been around the Abbeville Institute for a number of years. I can remember the first time that we came here, and this has been a wonderful venue and location. I know for some of you who this is your first opportunity to be in Seabrook, you have a lot to look forward to. Don't forget you have Charleston on Wednesday. You have a lot to look forward to there as well. One of the things that distinguishes the Abbeville Institute from other conservative organizations is, I want to say we take culture seriously, but many of my friends who are involved with other organizations will likely be offended if I were to say that, so I didn't say that, because they would argue that they take culture just as seriously as we do. But there is a big difference, and that is when we talk about culture, we do not mean a series of abstract ideas. We do not talk about principles. We do not talk about virtues. Those things are important, but when we talk about culture, we are talking about very specific ways of life. Ways of raising one's family, ways of exercising religious devotion, ways of singing, ways of speaking. Notice I said speaking, not speaking. And as those of you who are like me have been trying to counsel your children on how to pronounce words, there's a constant battle in my household over whether or not you pronounce that G at the end of present participles. And I keep insisting, no, you don't pronounce the G. And in good Southern fashion, some of my sons wish to resist my authority and appreciate pronouncing that G at every opportunity. On Thursday, I will be providing another lecture which goes hand in hand with this one, and I don't want to give too much away for that second lecture, but on Thursday, I want to try and place the Southern tradition within the context of 20th century American conservatism in a way that I'm not sure that we've really articulated or defined in any of our meetings previously. But today, I want to talk a little bit about what makes America exceptional. And note that I said what makes America exceptional, not what just makes the South exceptional. But I will talk about the South over the course of this presentation. In the introduction and the statement of principles of I'll Take My Stand, the Agrarian Manifesto produced by 12 Southerners that included David Donald, Andrew Lytle, Alan Tate, Robert Penn Warren, John Crow Ransom, Frank Owsley, and a number of others. In that statement of principles, Donald wrote that we have to resist efforts to pour culture in from the top. Pouring in of culture from the top. And if there is a characteristic of the modern era that began sometime in the 16th century and probably ended at the end of the 20th century, it is this insistence that culture is something that can be purposefully defined, it can be shaped, it can be created based on ideals, and whatever that systematic creation of culture may be, it can then be imposed upon a willing or not so willing population. In other words, what the 12 Southerners were resisting was an effort by outsiders to impose upon them a particular definition of what their culture ought to be. We understand this in such a way that, as was explained previously, that there has been almost in perpetuity a kind of culture war at play in American history, really from the beginnings of its colonial origins. And that's really what I'm going to talk about in this presentation today. But it is a mistake to assume that America's culture wars began sometime in the 1980s and 1990s just because sociologists of religion coined the term culture war, which was in some ways a derivation of some German terms from the early 20th century. The thing to understand about colonial America is that it was a period of rich diversity within the early modern era. Colonial America, contrary to popular opinions of seeing it merely as a clash between white European culture, singular, and Native American culture, singular, was in fact the creation of innumerable cultural groups scattered across Western Europe, and in some cases even Eastern Europe, that dotted the North American landscape, as well as that of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. I am not going to talk about Latin America in this presentation, nor will I really deal much with the Caribbean. But for many of us in today's world, we make a critical error in assuming that the colonial period was just one of homogeneity, of Europeans conquering the New World. We fail to understand the rich cultural diversity that existed in that period of time. The language groups, the dialects, the folkways, the political institutions, the economic institutions, and above all else, the visions of order that many of the colonial founders wished to pour upon their new settlements. And it is here that we begin the story. A story where each colonial visionary, whether it be William Bradford or John Winthrop in New England or the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, each colonial proprietor or colonizer had a vision of order which he hoped to impose upon the New World. Indeed, if ever there was a chance to do so, in the 1600s, it appeared that the New World of North America was just such a place. Those who popularized their efforts to colonize, those who attempted to sell stock in the various colonizing companies, and the earlier explorers themselves portrayed North America as a wilderness, as an area that might be the closest thing that we could find to a state of nature. Here was a land where Europeans could start from scratch. Hence, for each of those colonies, whether it be, again, Massachusetts Bay or Plymouth or Quaker, Pennsylvania, the visionaries who commenced those colonies had a particular kind of society that they hoped to create and impose upon the rest of the world. In fact, every colony was founded on two things, which were not always compatible with each other, but at least I want to mention both of them. First is that each colony had to make money. After all, the colonies were started by companies, which was slightly different from the way the Spanish and the Portuguese were building their colonies. Furthermore, each colony and with its founder, as I said, sought to realize some abstract vision of social order. They wanted to pour culture in from the top. Now let me run through these briefly for you, just to make sure we're all on the same playing field. In Virginia, there were effectively two visions of order. The first one failed, and then the second one also failed, but we'll get to that in a second. For the initial settlements of Virginia, under the Virginia Company, under the London Company, the idea was that this was a place of an Edenic paradise. It was like a new Eden. It was fresh. It was new. It was effectively sinless, such that the original inhabitants could come to Virginia. After all, it was named Virginia. And contrary to popular opinion, it was a double entendre. On one hand, it was a depiction of the virginal nature of Queen Elizabeth, but it was also a depiction of that the land itself was virgin and free from contamination. Very quickly, those colonists learned that it was anything but Eden. It was hot. There were mosquitoes. They discovered this crazy weather pattern that the Spanish had called tornadoes. They understood that the Indians were not necessarily peaceful. In fact, they were rather mean. They were not welcoming of these new settlers to come into their land. And so, as the story goes that many of us are familiar with, James Fort and subsequently Jamestown met disaster. So much so that we call this period the starving time. Many of the colonists died. In fact, most of them died. Roughly 80 to 90% of them died within just a few months of their arrival. And these were not men who were dandies by the way subsequent Puritan historians have portrayed them. Virginians were not dandies. They were not gentlemen. They were not just wealthy gentry folks who were afraid of work. As archaeologists at Jamestown have now really shown beyond a shadow of a doubt, Virginians died in those early settlements because they worked themselves to death. They wore armor all day. They became exhausted. Heat and malnutrition and the amount of calories they were consuming each day lowered their immune systems, and they quickly died. In replace of this, another vision emerged by the 1620s, and that was a vision of transplanting a landed English aristocracy to the New World. And I'll go into this in more detail here in a moment, but suffice it to say there was a second vision. So the first vision was that of an Edenic paradise. Second vision was that of a landed aristocracy based on large estates. The Pilgrims of Plymouth, who were en route to Virginia but were blown off course, arrived in what would eventually become Massachusetts. There they hoped to preserve a small community based on religious dissent. It would be a church. And the Mayflower Compact, which they created before they got off that ship and actually walked on Plymouth, was a desire to create a society, a community based on a church organization, that of a dissenting church organization. It was a kind of a congregational vision of order. The Massachusetts Bay, founded by the Puritans, would have a much more detailed vision of order, not only formulated by John Winthrop, but by a number of other Puritan theologians and ministers. There the goal was to create a Puritan order, and make no mistake, those who came over first were happy to oblige. They wanted to be in that order, and they wanted to make everything possible they could to see that it succeeded. In fact, when Puritan Massachusetts began to break down, many of the more ardent Puritans migrated to Connecticut to make another Puritan experiment. And then those who did not fit in so well with the Massachusetts Puritan experiment decided they would create a Baptist experiment in neighboring Rhode Island. William Penn and the Pennsylvanians hoped to prove to the world that Quakerism could function perfectly well if left to its own devices in the New World. They too had a religious vision of order which they sought to impose upon their new colony. East and West Jersey were formed to achieve basically the same purpose. East and West Jersey. How many of you knew there were two Jerseys? Okay, East and West Jersey. There were two. One is enough, but started out with two. Anyway, Catholic Maryland would be more than just a refuge for Roman Catholics. There, too, would be a realized vision of a Catholic social order. Dutch New Netherlands, like Virginia, was envisioned to be a home to the transplanted patroon hierarchy of the Netherlands. Again, another kind of landed aristocracy. And they created all sorts of incentives to bring patroons over to the New World, to create new estates along various rivers in what would become New York. Only one ever came, by the way. But Georgia would show the world that criminals could be rehabilitated in a world free from alcohol and sin. It was sort of like an early version of a gun-free zone, right? It was but it was a place where, again, another social order could be created. An abstract social order could be envisioned and then plopped down and would work out effectively. At least that's what they thought. And of course, the Lord's proprietor of Carolina, where we sit right now, went so far as to draw up a constitution that would transplant feudalism, medieval feudalism, to the New World. And not just any feudalism would do. It was French feudalism. Okay. French feudalism. You know, at the very least, they could have come up with English feudalism or something along those lines. But no, they had to make it even more abstract from reality, and so they wanted to bring in French feudalism. Now, I could go on with various illustrations of this. But what is important to understand that is that in each and every case, the colony was meant to be a new community based on ideal principles of what ought to be, not what was. That is to say, every colony was supposed to be culture poured in from the top. And every one of them failed, and failed miserably. Hundreds, if not thousands of people lost their lives trying to make these experimental visions of order work in the New World. And their lives were lost with no victory in sight. Political institutions ultimately collapsed or very nearly collapsed in each of the colonies. Proprietors who were awarded large land grants to support the crown lost control. Some colonies were divided, as in the case of Carolina. Others were united, as in the case of East and West Jersey. The original religious groups declined or were quickly outnumbered in places like Pennsylvania and Maryland. Things were so bad that a couple of colonies even passed from one country to another without firing a shot. The best examples of those, of course, will be the Swedish colony in the Northeast, which I don't think any of you are familiar with the Swedish efforts to colonize North America. We do get the Conestoga wagon from those people. That's pretty much it. Maybe log cabins, but that's up for debate. And of course, New Netherlands was passed over to Great Britain, to England, without firing a shot and became New York. Hierarchical social systems were only partially transplanted to the New World because colonists soon realized that what made for a landed elite was limited ownership of land. And that was something that proved to be nearly impossible in the New World. If there was anything prevalent in North America, it was land. And so a hierarchical system like that of the British Isles, or like that even of parts of France, or like that of the patroonship system in the Netherlands, was almost impossible to transplant fully to the New World, because you don't have limited land ownership. You talk about, well, I'm the squire of this area. Well, no, sir, I'm just going to move to the next county, and there's plenty of land there. This is also one of the reasons, by the way, that Virginia was one of the first places in the modern world where daughters were able to inherit land separate from their brothers, and where daughters were able to own land and property separate from their fathers until they got married. There will be a lasting legacy of this, by the way. A couple of centuries later, it's going to be southern territories and southern states, which are the first in the United States to allow women to own property separate from their husbands. It's not going to happen in Ohio. It's not going to happen in Massachusetts. It's going to happen in Arkansas. Anyway, efforts to create a sugar culture in this part of the Carolina Low Country is another example of failure, as did the dream of controlling African slaves along the same pattern of that as Caribbean slavery. We seem to forget this often. Caribbean slavery was not successfully transplanted to the New World. They did everything they could to transplant that type of system, which was built on absolute control of every facet of the slave's life. That proved to be ineffective. It was not something that would work very well here, partly because sugar could not be grown here, and rice culture, which was sort of accidentally started in the Low Country and saved the Low Country colonies, did not require that kind of control. You had a different kind of slavery that sort of evolved here. It was very different from what they hoped to impose. But as I said earlier, perhaps worst of all, the colonists, notably New Englanders, realized that the New World wasn't a wilderness after all. Hundreds of thousands of Eastern Indians, speaking dozens of languages and dialects, already inhabited the land and did not prove to be the docile, childlike savages, back when the word savage was a positive term, living in some earthly paradise. Many New Englanders, when they arrived following John Winthrop's expedition, about 20,000 of them came in the 1620s. Many of them actually occupied farms and villages that had been deserted by Native Americans. So there was no carving up of the wilderness in that part of North America. It was, look, there's some houses up there. They're kind of like huts, but they simply went and inhabited those places. Fields were already cleared. Even the intervention of Prince James, Duke of York, and the entire might of the English crown in the 1670s and 1680s to directly govern the colonies along the absolutist lines of continental despots ended in failure. This was the Dominion of New England, in which James decided to merge New England with his own private colony, which he named after himself, New York. That too ended in failure. In other words, at every step of the way, failure characterized the colonization of English North America. In fact, perhaps the only colonial group not to meet failure were the Scots-Irish, who were the last people to arrive before independence. And they avoided failure precisely because they arrived with no vision for the future. None whatsoever. They had nothing to lose, and therefore they sought no new effort to pour culture in from the top in which to gain. So what does all of this mean? And again, I could provide many more details about this and how these failures came about. But it would be my argument that this is what makes America truly exceptional: colonial failure. We don't see that in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. By every measure of their criteria for success, they were successful. The vast sums of wealth were extracted from the New World and sent back to Europe. The hierarchical system, the social systems in which they sought to create and impose upon the New World were largely successfully transplanted and managed to survive for centuries longer than even the English colonies were able to survive. Caribbean efforts to impose and create culture was also fairly successful, with the possible exception of Barbados, where indentured servitude reached such a critical problem that essentially the colony kind of dissolved and people fled. At one point, the population density of Barbados rivaled that of modern-day Tokyo. But overall, southern colonies, Mexico South, were successful. Northern colonies were not. And this is why the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese typically laughed at the English. You can't even colonize a cooler area than we could. Everything was to your advantage, and you still failed. And for many in the growing British Empire during the 1700s, they took a similar approach and assumed that by and large, their experimentation with colonies was itself, if not a failure, it was certainly not as successful as they had dreamed and hoped, which is why we have another reason for the exceptional nature of colonial America. From roughly 1710 forward, British administrators ignored the colonies. The colonies were not where it was at. The colonies were these backward people. They spoke a funny version of English, which we no longer speak ourselves. They eat weird food. It makes them a lot taller than us, but who wants to eat all that stuff? They looked at the colonies as a sign of backwardness. They looked at the colonies as their past, not their future. And as the commercialization of British society moved forward over the course of the 1700s, the distance between the British elite and their colonists grew wider and wider. Now, there is a couple of lessons to be learned from this, and I started off with one, and I want to go through this in a little more detail. And that is, by and large, political institutions in the colonies collapsed or nearly collapsed in every instance. Now, that means something, folks. And the primary meaning that comes from that the colonists are going to learn from this is politics and political institutions will not be the singular source of social order. That politics would not be supreme. And that's an incredibly important lesson. And it's a lesson that colonists after colonists learn from the genuine wilderness of Maine all the way south into Georgia and the western frontier. That politics could not be a source of sustainable wealth, that politics could not be a source of sustainable social order, and instead the colonists need to rely upon other kinds of institutions to lay the groundwork of any kind of genuine communal life and what we've been calling here this morning social order. Now, it is at this point that you see a second major theme of colonial America that's going to characterize what is truly exceptional about the United States. And that's going to be a proliferation of social institutions. The colonists are going to come to rely upon those things that they knew best. Their families, their family customs, their ways of organizing their local communities without political assistance. They're going to rely upon religious institutions. They're going to rely upon culinary institutions. They're going to rely upon trading and commercial institutions that they devise just really as a reflection of circumstance. It's not going to be something that they envision and invent from nothing. In other words, the colonists are going to come to rely heavily upon tradition, custom, and habit, not upon idealized forms of organizing their society. And this is going to be the case throughout the colonies. Now, I'm going to come, as I conclude this in a few minutes, I want to come back to why the South was even more unique. But for right now, we're talking about all the colonies. So there is a proliferation of social institutions. Colonial North America, ladies and gentlemen, starts to look more like medieval Europe than it does modern Europe. You have the emergence of many different kinds of associations and institutions, politics being only one of those. So there may be family institutions. I don't have a PowerPoint, so you're going to have to just imagine this as I wave my hands. Family institutions, religious institutions, commercial institutions, social institutions and associations, private associations. It's a series of parallel societies that are overlapping in jurisdiction and claims upon colonists. And I emphasize that term claims because I want to again draw that connection with a kind of medieval order. In the same sense that medieval Europeans had to juggle a series of different claims that were placed upon them, either as peasants or as members of the aristocracy or as serfs, colonists in North America also had to learn to juggle all of these different claims. And because political institutions had effectively collapsed, no one institution, person, or thing could exercise genuine sovereignty. What made colonial America unique is that it was a world without sovereignty. It was a world without one person being able to exercise a final trump. Can I say trump? Is that okay? A final trump upon the cards everyone else was playing. There was no trump card in colonial America. Yes, they had a king. Yes, they swore allegiance to that king. Nobody ever saw the king. They might have celebrated the king's birthday, much the way Southerners celebrate the 4th of July today. It's an excuse to eat and smell gunpowder. What could be better, right? And so this is a world where no one organization or association is going to be able to claim absolute sovereignty upon one person or a group of people. Even families were strained. And I won't go into this in much detail, except to say that family institutions, as we're beginning to realize in colonial America, were strong. They were very strong, probably stronger than they are today. But those families were not absolute in their power and control, partly because of the land issue. At the point at which parents may become too oppressive in the minds of their adolescent children, they simply left. The children left and they moved east. And it's astonishing, I think, for many of us to consider how easily and how quickly children left their parents and moved west. Now, occasionally they would take their parents with them, or parents would take their children. But by and large, especially in the colonial South, where people are moving as families, family units, they would get married and then they would move west. This showed that even family institutions were not completely supreme in everyone's life. Religious institutions, of course, were also not supreme in people's lives. As we see with the proliferation of dissenter groups and disestablished religious sects like Baptist and even later on Methodist. So what happens is that America becomes a world of endless, overlapping, parallel associations. Now, those of you who are familiar with American history or the history of American political thought, or maybe you're familiar with modern American conservatism, this is going to sound a lot like Alexis de Tocqueville's depiction of America. Tocqueville was a French prison reformer, I guess is the best thing I could say about him. He came to the United States in the 1830s and wrote a 2-volume depiction of American life, which is translated as entitled Democracy in America. It's one of the most important works of an observer of 19th century America, and it's something that a lot of conservative intellectuals find really dear to their way of understanding these things. After all, what I have described to you sounds very similar to what Edmund Burke, the father of modern conservatism, describes as the little platoons that make life worth living. Much of what I've described to you is also similar to what the Scottish philosopher David Hume meant when he used the term common life to describe the way, not in his case Americans, but the way many Americans were living. But I want to be clear that Tocqueville's understanding of these associations is very different from what I am describing to you today. Tocqueville described and called these associations intermediary institutions. For Tocqueville, and again, you have to watch my hands here instead of a PowerPoint. For Tocqueville, these intermediary institutions, why did the intermediary, moyen, the institution, the middle institution, why did he call them that? He argued that in the United States, there were these broad associations that existed between the state at the top of that society and individuals at the bottom of that society. In other words, state at the top, or politics, associations in the middle, individuals at the bottom. Broad bottom, middling middle, small top. It's still a triangular and pyramidal system. Ladies and gentlemen, Tocqueville still described a modern society. That was not America. America instead was a society in which all of these associations were on a level playing field, where politics and political institutions were just another kind of association. They were not supreme. It was just another way of doing business with each other. Well, if I couldn't make money doing this with somebody, I know I can go buy off some politicians. I'll just make money that way, which was really characteristic of much of 19th century state politics. The point here being that the understanding we have of American associations is really a modern understanding because we look at it through the lens of Tocqueville. If we stand back and we look at this as the way these institutions really evolved, we have a very different picture. Why don't Americans like politics? Because politics is just another association. Today I'm interested in politics. In the fall, I'll be interested in football. Today, I'm interested in the Hillary campaign. Oh, I'm sorry, let me not say that. Today, I'm interested in the Bernie campaign. In a few months, I'll be interested in a marijuana campaign, right? Or I'm not, but you know what I'm talking about. So it's just another fact. It's just another kind of institution that people will go through. All right. Well, let me bring this, start bringing this to a conclusion. So, politics is not supreme. Political institutions are not supreme. It is a world without sovereignty. It is a world where the modern language of sovereignty is often used, and we see this throughout the founding era as Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and so many other Federalists insist we must create a government where there is no imperium in imperio. There must be a singular sovereign. There must be one institution that exercises that trump card. Time and time again, nationalists in the Continental Congress who called themselves federal men, led by Hamilton and Madison, insisted this must be the case. When they reformed the Articles of Confederation, or attempt to reform the Articles, it's an effort to create a singular sovereignty. At the Philadelphia Convention, conversation and debate consistently revolved around the demands to create a singular sovereign. The Federalists, in their defenses of the Constitution, again insisted this must be about creating a singular sovereign to avoid imperium in imperio. And each time they failed. There was resistance. Americans pushed back because they understood what was at stake was the very thing that defined them, and that was that proliferation of institutions, all of which were effectively equal, though not equally demanding of the individual's attention, but none of which were more powerful than anything else. So at the heart of American exceptionalism is not individual liberty. At the heart of American exceptionalism is not the idea of equality. At the heart of American exceptionalism is not an insistence that somehow North Americans were more chosen by our Lord to achieve some particular purpose in the world. At the heart of American exceptionalism is the freedom of Americans to freely associate when, how, and with whom they please, and to protect those associations and all the habits and all the traditions and all the unwritten rules that characterize them. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, in the Jeffersonian political tradition, which we often talk so much about as part of this institute, the one term that the Jeffersonians repeatedly use more than anything else to describe what they opposed, what they hoped to prevent, the term they used was consolidation. Consolidation in all of its forms. For Jeffersonian Americans, they understood that human beings were naturally drawn together, and thought what was needed to preserve their liberty and their prosperity was constant efforts to keep Americans apart, to keep them in their different associations. Because the temptation was to take one of those associations, say the federal government, and make it supreme over all the rest. That's what they meant by consolidation. That's what they hoped to avoid. And I might add, if we look very carefully to what the Southern agrarians said, because the term they used to describe the world in which they wished to oppose was industrialization. But if we look at what they are really defining as industrialization, it's very close to what the Jeffersonians were describing as consolidation. Those Asians are pretty bad. Well, let me conclude for just 2 or 3 minutes in talking about where this goes in the 19th century. How does this exceptionality, these different associations, these parallel societies make a difference? I just want to give you a few random thoughts here. First of all, it does mean that 19th century Americans live in a world where government is limited. And government is not just limited because of constitutions. Government's not just limited because of checks and balances. Government is limited primarily because its sovereignty is in effect limited by all these other institutions. Governments could not do anything they wanted because so many other institutions might already be doing those things or otherwise would resist those encroachments in much the same way a medieval European kingdom might resist the efforts of a neighboring lord to encroach upon their jurisdiction as well. It also means that entrepreneurship in the United States is going to follow a very specific pattern that is different from entrepreneurship in the rest of the world. And give me just a couple of minutes to describe what I mean by this, because I think it's pretty important. The most successful entrepreneurs in 19th century America were not inventors of stuff. Yeah, we invented some stuff. I mean, we have McCormick's, Reaper. There are definitely things that make a profound difference upon manufacturing and really the industrialization of the United States. But if we look carefully at those people who were most profound in their entrepreneurial activity in North America, these were people who learned not how to make stuff, but how to move stuff from one place to another, from one association to another, from one community to another, from one parallel society to another. In other words, the people who were most successful were those who could bridge those barriers that demarcated all of these different societies. This is why the most profound entrepreneurs of the 19th century were involved in shipping, in the construction of railroads, in the development of communication like newspapers. It's why our buddy who invented the telegraph, Samuel Morse, though I think he mainly invented the language we use, the telegraph, probably had the single most profound impact not only on American life in the 19th century, but is probably the person who still impacts our lives today. All of these little devices that I'm looking at that are ringing up here in front of me, telling me I've met my time limit, they still operate on Morse's language of on, off, I, O, ones and zeros. They still operate on that. Moving technology, moving information, moving people, moving services. This is what serves as the groundwork for 19th century American entrepreneurship. And even if we look today, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, at our most profound entrepreneurs, they are people who have succeeded at moving stuff and moving people and moving services and moving information in profoundly new ways. That's different from Europeans who learn how to make stuff. Well, why is that? What is it about the United States? Is it the size of the United States? Yeah, probably. But it's also because the real talent lies in being able to navigate all of those different associations that characterize our life. As Wendell Phillips once remarked, as we often talk about, Southerners knew how to manage men, New Englanders knew how to run machines. Southerners understood how to manage men because they had more associations they had to manage. New Englanders did not. Well, let me conclude by saying one thing. The South will be different because of one important event that will reiterate this importance of associations that I've described, and that was the Civil War and Reconstruction, where all of the colonies underwent one wave of the failure of political institutions. The South will undergo, 150 years later, another wave of failure of political institutions. And as both the Confederate states and then the reconstructed state governments collapse over the course of the 1860s and 1870s, Southerners will remember an important lesson that their colonial forebears had learned themselves on the frontier, and that is, you cannot trust politics and politicians. That political institutions will not deliver you to salvation. No other group of people in the United States experience that second round of institutional failure and are forced by necessity to rely once again upon social institutions and social associations in such an incredible way. Why does the South remain most conservative today? It's because they learned not once but twice that politicians can't be trusted. Thank you.